In this video, we're going to talk about while loops. What exactly is a while loop? A while loop is a loop that repeats a set of actions while a condition is true. The loop is going to stop running as soon as the provided condition is false. You may be thinking to yourself, is a while loop the same thing as a for loop? Definitely not. A while loop can be used to do the same thing as a for loop, but really a while loop is intended to be used in a different situation. In a for loop, we know exactly what values we want to iterate over ahead of time, and you can do the same thing in a while loop, but in general, a while loop is better suited when we don't know how many times we need to iterate. So for example, a time that we commonly use a while loop is when we want to iteratively improve an approximation one iteration at a time. As we do this approximation, we don't know how many times we're going to need to do this iteration until our approximation is smaller than some standard of precision. And so because of that, we can't use a for loop. If we used a for loop, we would go a fixed number of times and then we would stop. But for a while loop, we can keep going until we achieve the desired level of precision. This pseudocode provides the basic syntax of a while loop. We start with the word while, indicating that we want to implement a while loop, and then we have a space, and then in parentheses we have a condition. So this is some statement, some logical statement that's going to return true or false. And it's very important that we only get a single true or a single false, otherwise it's not going to work properly. If that condition is true, then we're going to run the code inside our curly braces. And a really simple way of thinking about a while loop is that while our condition is true, run the following code. However, that previous explanation may cause you to miss a very important aspect of a while loop. We don't simply run the code inside the curly braces one time, but we keep running it again and again and again as long as this condition is true. So here's what actually happens when we run a while loop. So we start off by checking if the condition is true. If it is, then we run the code inside the curly braces. Then we go back to the condition and ask ourselves, is this condition still true? If the condition is still true, we run the code again. And we keep going through that process over and over and over again until finally, hopefully, the condition ends up being false. So there should be something that is run inside our code here that affects whether this condition is true or false. If we don't do that, then we're going to have a problem. Now let's do a really simple example of a while loop. In fact, this while loop is probably not the canonical case for how you would use a while loop. This could actually be done using a for loop instead, but it really illustrates exactly what happens in a while loop. So what we're going to do is start off by setting an iterator I equal to 1. Then we start our while loop, and we ask ourselves, is I less than 4? That's our condition. If that is true, then we run the code inside the curly braces, which is we print the message, the current iterator value is I, and so we're going to print the current value of the iterator, and then, this is key here, we increment I by 1. So we take the current value of I, we add 1, and then we assign that the name I again. So what we're doing is we're incrementing I. So we're going to go from I equals 1 to I equals 2, and so on. So let's run this loop. And perhaps unsurprisingly, since we start off with I equals 1, I is less than 4, we print the current iterator value as 1, we increment I, we check our condition. I is now 2, so I is still less than 4, so we're going to print our message once again and get the current iterator value as 2. We then increment I again, we get I equals 3, we go back to our condition, I is still less than 4 because it's 3, so we print the message once again, the current iterator value is 3, then we increment I to 4, and we go back to our condition, and now I equals 4, and because of that, I is not less than 4. So instead of running this code again, we actually just exit our while loop. One of the things I wanted to point out in more detail is that while loops tend to be more dangerous than for loops because it's very easy to create something called an infinite loop that never stops running. So in a for loop, we have a specific set of values that we're iterating over, but with a while loop, we just keep checking a condition. And so if that condition is always satisfied, the while loop is going to keep running indefinitely. It will never stop. So the loop will keep on running indefinitely, or hopefully until some sort of error occurs that causes the loop to close. So sometimes I've had loops that run out of memory, for example. So if you want to crash your computer, then you could run this following code on your computer. I'm not going to actually run it here because it's going to create an infinite loop, and we'll explain why. So in this example here, we start off by setting I equal to 2. And then we say, while I is greater than 0, we want to square I and then store it as I once again. Here's the problem. We start off with I being greater than 0 since it's 2. Okay, we square it, we get 4. We update I, we go back, and I is going to be greater than 4. But every time we square I, it's just going to be a positive number, so it's always going to be greater than 0. So this loop will never stop by itself. It's going to keep going until either we stop the process, the computer runs out of memory, we get some sort of problem with being able to store the number because it might get too large, the computer might not be able to store that properly. But this is an example of an infinite loop. And while this is a really trivial example where it's very obvious that this is going to be an infinite loop, it's pretty easy, unfortunately, with a while loop to have a subtle problem in your code that leads to an infinite loop that you weren't expecting. So you might be asking yourself, well, what do I do if I get stuck in an infinite loop? Well, thankfully, there's a couple of options in R that you can use. So one is to press Control-C if you're on a PC or Command-C if you're on a Mac. Sometimes that will stop a loop. Sometimes there's actually a stop button available in the R console. If that is the case, then clicking the stop button will attempt to stop the loop. In RStudio, we can click Session in the menu and then click Interrupt R to stop the code being executed. Okay, so I decided to run my infinite loop here in the R console in RStudio. And just so you can see how you get out of an infinite loop here, I'm going to go up to Session, Interrupt R, and it quits out of my infinite loop. Hopefully that's helpful to you, and I hope that you have a better understanding of while loops.